Asymmetric games where players don't just have different capabilities but fill fundamentally different roles, have been around for a long time, but they really came into the limelight with Leader Games' Vast. It was heralded as a new type of game where each player's goal and mechanics were so divergent that it was more akin to everyone playing an entirely different yet overlapping game. Problem was that the barrier to entry and learning the game was high, and being Leader Games' first major release, distribution was initially low, so it was more of a proof of concept. Now we have the standalone sequel, Vast Mysterious Manor, trading in the high fantasy of Crystal Caverns for a dark gothic spooktacular. Though the two games feel familiar and there's rough parity between the roles, Mysterious Manor aims to be easier to learn, have tighter balance, and be all around more fun. Okay, so what is Vast though? Well, the game plays on a board and you're going to end up controlling one or more figures that in some way, depending on their roles, are going to move around the board, end up populating the board with different tiles. You're going to be bashing each other upside the head, breaking down walls, doing all kinds of things, all propelling towards your goal. To distill it down to its barest parts, think procedurally generated dungeon crawler. But what are those roles? The Paladin is your basic hero, who gains experience, gets abilities, increases stats, spends actions to move, beats things upside the head, bashes down walls, and does generally heroic shit. He wants to kill the spider. The spider, or spiderlings, or sorcerer, is a shapeshifter who swaps between all three roles. Her job is to raise terror mainly by setting up and protecting stuff like eggs, using her deck of spells, and each form has a different sort of specialty. Then there's the Skeletons, an autonomous collective that each move and act in order, and you recruit more and more to independently act and get independently smushed as the game goes on. They also raid the Manor for tons of rad fantasy loot to outfit each other. Their goals: 1. Get more skeletons, 2. Look super fabulous, and 3. Kill the Paladin. The Warlock is really into domination, but more the enslaved thrall variety? I mean, I guess it could be both, but whatever. They are all about cursing and dominating the ghouls and treasure that populate the board, but cannot coexist on tiles with other roles and plays in a sort of abstract puzzle-ish type realm. And the Manor is, well, the essence of the building itself, but now helpfully personified by the Wraith. You mix up tiles, blocking other players, and work towards casting rituals by moving your sweet, sweet Wraith boy in specific patterns, matching your cards to seal the Manor forever. What's really cool is that each of these roles are jam-packed with little references to fantasy gaming tropes, or just fantasy and gaming in general. I mean, little nods and winks, things that make you go, ah, I see what you were going for there, whether it's really overt or subtle. I mean, from the way that the skeletons kind of feel like a real-time strategy, to the paladins leveling up, to the incredibly thematic and mechanically meaningful moment where a spider in any form gets smacked and then just dissolves into a bunch of spiderlings laying on the ground there and having to recover in that position, is really cool. But if we look at Vast as a fundamental structure, a playground for these roles to play in apart from the roles themselves, well then it gets a little less compelling. If I were to be reductive, which I am, every role is just trying to disrupt others while propelling towards their own goal, and this usually constitutes moving, adding, or flipping tiles, grabbing stuff popped up onto the board, or putting something somewhere hopefully out of reach. Sure, there are systems in place that give you an arc of increasing power and capability, but in a conflict-heavy game where you succeed at pretty much anything you can do as long as you can do it, feels kinda dull. Sure, there are some interesting choices to make, but the complexity and ultimate joy comes from the competing operations and goals of the characters, not the internal systems of the game. Look, that's not a horrible thing. I've had fun playing this game, but the learning curve in just wrapping your brain around yours and everyone else's roles can be incredibly oppressive. That makes it hard to learn, it makes it hard to teach, and especially hard to even get your bearings on how to interact with the game in the first place without getting completely taken advantage of. Speaking of which, this game relies on the roles to really pull on one another, providing equal amounts of competing tension to function, and having the right group, the right experience level, the right number of players can be tough. Sure, there are all sorts of variants accounted for to play the game at lower player counts, but they feel like compromises, taking away from what the game does best, which is the interaction and the competitive tug of each of those roles on one another, which, when that's being done in equal force, it does make for a really tense game, just not a lot of depth. And that's the thing, right? If this were a more complex game with this level of asymmetry, it might just be downright ludicrous. So instead, you get the trappings of a heroic dungeon crawl, complete with systems for leveling up and growing more powerful, but there's a reason dungeon crawls tend to carry elements from game to game where the persistence gives some substance. But if you look at what it is rather than what it's not, it works. At its best, players know what to expect from one another's characters, and there are some cool strategies you can employ to gain the upper hand and evade the efforts of your opponents. There are really cool moments. It just takes a lot to get there. Now, if you recall, I loved Leader's last release, Root, which in essence tries to do the same thing that Vast does, just in a different gameplay system. So what's the difference? Well, for one, I think Root is fundamentally more strategic, which means that players are compelled to wring the most out of their individual factions, wanting to explore the depths that they offer. But also, I think that it has some more familiar touchstones that players can wrap their brains around a little bit more. You have units that are on the board, they move around to different areas which they hope to control, they'll attack other units, it's dudes on a map, and you're each trying to get points until someone reaches the point limit and they win. How you do it looks a little bit different, but conceptually it's a little easier to digest, which in turn makes it easier to teach any of the individual factions. Now, with Vast, on the other hand, things are a little bit more esoteric, and that's okay. When it's at its best, when players have really invested in it and everyone knows what everyone else is doing and understands how buck wild each of the different factions and players operate, then this game is really tightly balanced, it's smart, it's beautiful, and it does things that no other game outside of the original Vast, the Crystal Caverns, does. That alone is worth noting. So if you're still on board the Vast train, then here's a couple more things worth mentioning. First, Leader is much more experienced as pioneers in the asymmetric field, and this is a much more accessible version of the game than Crystal Caverns. As far as tutorials go, I think they did about as good of a job as you can do to learn the game. I highly recommend that you get a full table with all the roles, have patient players who have read at minimum their pages in the rulebook, then follow the example first turns. These are really well designed to give you an initial thrust to operate your first game. Second, don't be afraid to look for specific resources out there. I'd recommend the Lonely Man Board Games channel, as he's done a lot of Root and Vast how to play videos, which are a fantastic resource. Third, if you are going to get into this madness, might as well go all in. The expansion Haunted Hallways adds new characters and new skeletons which can be swapped out for certain characters from the base game. As I said, the fun of this game is witnessing how the unique characters interact with one another, and more characters will give you more possible combinations, though it also means having to learn how they operate. That said, everything feels a lot more familiar to other characters in the base game than the base game characters feel from one another, so it's not as big of a jump. And also, it's really rad seeing the return of the knight from Crystal Caverns. Extra skeletons with their own unique abilities are always welcome, and the Shadow Paladin is just flat out cool. If I'm honest, this game isn't really for me. I mean, it plays best at higher player counts, and my bigger group only tends to visit games a couple times a year, and the act of learning and relearning this game every time that we dust it off would get to be a really big slog. And also, the fun that I had with the game was mainly academic. It was the joy of witnessing the asymmetry itself, but that can quickly wear off. In the end, while I think it's better than its predecessor in virtually every single way, that it's beautiful, thematic, and clever, it's just too high of complexity for too little depth. It's a spectacle, a novelty. Heck, I'd go so far as to say that with the ambitious goals of this game, it's a downright achievement that it works in the first place. But once I was done with the experience, I was happy to move on. And that is our review. Thank you so much for watching. I've been Jack for the Cardboard Herald. If you enjoyed this video, we have all kinds of other reviews, interviews, and recommendations via writing, podcasts, and video here on our channel and website cardboardherald.com. Our content is audience supported, so if you want to show your support, please visit our Patreon. Thank you so much for watching. This has been the Cardboard Herald.